Let's go to Washington because the Trump administration released a significant document in the early hours of Friday morning without fanfare, press conference, just solely an update on the White House website. It is a newly published US national security strategy now being scrutinised by diplomats around the world. 33 pages setting out the Trump administration's vision to, quote, ensure America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, successful country for the decades to come. In order to get it right, all Americans need to know what exactly it is we're trying to do, it says. It critiques what the president calls past globalist policies, overextended US resources, and it introduces the concept of, quote, Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine goes back to the 1830s and President James Monroe, who opposed interference in the Western Hemisphere, that is North and South America, spelling out the American continent was off limits to outside interference. Well, this is being revised. Another core priority in the security strategy is titled The Era of Mass Migration is Over, asserting that past Western experience shows it's strained domestic resources, increased violence and undermined national security. And there's a section 2 on the reframing of relations with each continent, which comes with a damning critique of Europe, where it cites economic decline being eclipsed by the prospects of civilizational erasure, and that the EU and other transnational bodies undermine political liberty, migration policies, and censor free speech. It predicts that at the current rate, the continent will be unrecognisable in 20 years or less. Now, this US policy going forward, it says, should include, quote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory. And
Hello, Bobby Jones here for Midas Touch and Valor Media Networks. This past week, Donald Trump and his administration released a national security strategy. This is a document that comes out roughly every 4 years, put out by each presidential administration, that highlights the United States and its priorities when it comes to its defense and how it relates to the rest of the world. Now, this document and its periodicity goes back decades, and it allows the United States to communicate, hey, this is how we're going to structure our military forces. This is how we're going to structure our economy. This is what matters to us. Now, despite having different members of political parties in the White House over the last few decades, there have been common things that all presidents stress. Typically, the strengthening of alliances, the deterrence of authoritarian rule, and hopefully the promotion and economic growth, not only of the United States, but trade relations all over the world. Well, when President Trump released his national security strategy this past week, it caught the attention of many strategists because it is a sharp departure from what I just described. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what he actually released and how radically different it is just from his predecessor, Joe Biden's national security strategy, and how we're already seeing the aspects of this security strategy being enacted by the current administration. The basic overview is this. President Trump's national security strategy breaks from 75 years of American tradition, where President Biden talked about strengthening alliances to create the ultimate deterrence from aggressive acts. President Trump is saying, hey, it's all about America by itself, and basically the rest of the world be damned. So let's talk about the first aspect, specifically alliances. Biden looked at things as a force multiplier, and Trump looks at things as a transactional way of doing business. When Biden put out his national security strategy, he talked about how alliances are America's greatest strategic advantage. That's a direct quote. He talked about how strengthening NATO, Indo-Pacific partnerships, and coalitions across the world not only helps strengthen and extend the United States' power, but helps stabilize their allies and their environments as well. He called it integrated deterrence, meaning no nation will stand by itself. By the fact that you have multiple nations willing to stand on behalf of others, it deters the aggression of, say, a Vladimir Putin or a China. Those were the thought processes, and it's worked for basically almost 80 years post-World War II. President Trump, however, has a completely different view of that. He looks at alliances as bad business deals. Why? Because he looks at the other nations, say in NATO, and say they are not paying their fair share. They are not doing this. He's looking at just straight numbers. The thing is, he does not look at the deployments that those same NATO countries made on behalf of the United States right after 9/11, the blood shed on a battlefield for Americans that were attacked, and did it for 2 decades. He also does not talk about how, hey, being able to be stationed and have military bases all over the world, part of these alliances, helps create a safer America as well as a safer global environment for not just literally military action, but economic growth too. He does not mention any of that because, as you know, there are no military bases in the United States from foreign nations. It's a one-way deal. The bottom line is President Trump considers our closest allies as customers in a business, while Biden treated them as allies, partners, brothers in arms. One of the next major points in the national security strategy that departs from norms is the support of authoritarianism vice democracy. So President Biden, he framed things very clearly when it came to global conflict. He looked at it as far as democracy versus authoritarianism. He defended and promoted democratic norms as well as human rights that were attached to them as primary security interests, both in the United States and abroad. He understands that those values are part of soft power that the United States could always advocate for. President Trump, however, looks at it different. He explicitly rejects promotion of democracy abroad. He says the United States should not push their values across the world. Well, the first thing I would say to that is democratic values are not a uniquely American thing. That is something that ties directly back to human rights, things that the United Nations themselves have sanctioned as far as basic fundamental human rights, and something that Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, Australia, all of these continents have multiple countries that push these same norms. The reality is authoritarianism creates these moral vacuums that countries like Russia and China go out of their way to exploit. And the United States has always been the backstop to push back against it. However, you've got to ask yourself, why does President Trump advocate so hard and is willing to meet with leaders of authoritarian nations like North Korea, Russia, and China? Well, it's because democratic governments are supposed to be held accountable to the people of those nations. And President Trump, as we have seen throughout many of his actions, both in his first administration and his second administration, has a very serious problem being held accountable. Immigration, migration, things that happen all over the world to different countries. President Biden's national security strategy looked at immigration as something that helps fuel innovation, growth, and even military talent. America has a long history of accepting immigrants that have made life much better for every American that lives here. He treated migration as a very complex but yet needed hemispheric challenge, and the value of being able to attract talent to the United States was critical for shaping the future of the United States. President Trump completely disagrees with that. He looks at migration and immigration as a burden. As a matter of fact, quote, he said, "The era of mass migration must end," unquote. This, of course, falls in line with the isolationist policy that President Trump has. He believes in his mind that the United States by itself can not only maintain its status in the world, but to become a much greater nation if it cuts itself off from the world and stops dealing, as he deems it, with lesser countries. But the irony of it is this: America actually gets safer by attracting top-notch quality talent to its borders instead of closing the door in its face. At the end of the day, the new national security strategy put out by President Trump is a game changer. It walks away from 8 decades of concentrated effort of trying to make the world a little bit more connected and a lot more safe. He signals for the alienation of partners and allies while accepting strong men, and to remove America really from that lead position on the global stage, especially when talking about democratic norms, human rights, climate change, etc. In 30 plus pages, He wipes away what most people around the world, at least idealistically, viewed the United States as, and put into writing its own isolated agenda. That's not going to be good for the United States nor the rest of the world.